April 1945. The grand machines that had once terrified Allied tank crews now sat silent and defeated, their hulking forms standing as metal monuments to Germany's failed ambitions. Among the spoils of war captured by American forces pushing into the Reich's industrial heartland were several Panther tanks, widely considered the Wehrmacht's most effective armored fighting vehicle. Studying these mechanical beasts had become a priority for Allied technical intelligence teams seeking to understand the strengths and weaknesses of German engineering. At the heart of this inquiry was a puzzling question that had confounded American tank crews throughout the European campaign. Why did these fearsome machines, with their superior firepower and armor, so consistently miss when firing while on the move? In a makeshift workshop outside Frankfurt, Captain Howard Miller wiped grease from his hands as he stood back from the partially disassembled Panther. The 32-year-old Detroit native had been an automotive engineer at General Motors before the war, and now his expertise was being put to use analyzing captured enemy vehicles. His weathered face, prematurely aged by 3 years of combat engineering assignments, showed both exhaustion and intense concentration as he studied the tank's drive system. "Thompson, get over here and look at this," he called to his colleague, a wiry lieutenant who had been examining the Panther's gun mounting mechanism. Lieutenant Robert Thompson approached, his glasses smudged with oil and grime. Before the war, he had worked as a research engineer for Westinghouse, specializing in stabilization systems for naval gunnery. Since 1943, he had been part of the team that refined the vertical stabilizer system used in American Sherman tanks. "What have you found?" he asked, squinting at the component Miller was pointing to. "Is that what I think it is?" The two men exchanged meaningful glances as they realized they might have discovered a critical weakness in German tank design philosophy. The workshop itself was a repurposed German truck maintenance facility, hastily converted to serve the Allied technical intelligence mission. Massive skylights let in the spring sunshine, illuminating the 3 Panther tanks in various states of disassembly. One had been split open like a metal cadaver, its turret removed and placed beside the hull, internal components meticulously labeled and catalogued. Scattered throughout the cavernous space were smaller stations where specific systems, engines, transmissions, optics, weapons, were being examined in isolation. The air was heavy with the smell of grease, gasoline, and the acrid tang of cutting torches. In the corner, a radio played Glenn Miller's American Patrol, the upbeat melody creating an incongruous soundtrack to the methodical dissection of Germany's war machines. Miller ran his hand along the massive 75mm K-Baruch 42 L70 gun barrel that had made the Panther such a formidable opponent. "You know, I talked to some tankers from the 3rd Armored who encountered these things in the Ardennes. They said the Panthers were deadly accurate when firing from stationary positions, could knock out a Sherman at 1,500 yards with the first shot. But the moment they started moving, or had to fire quickly after stopping, their accuracy went to hell." He tapped the gun mounting mechanism. "I think we've just figured out why." Thompson nodded, reaching for his notebook to document their findings. "It's not just what they included in the design that matters. Sometimes it's what they left out that tells the real story." The brutally cold winter that had blanketed Eastern Europe was finally beginning to release its grip as the Soviet offensive gained momentum along the Oder River. For Senior Lieutenant Vasily Kropotkin of the Red Army's 5th Guards Tank Army, the memory of his first encounter with a Panther tank remained etched in his mind like frost on glass. It had been during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, when the new German tanks had made their combat debut. His T-34 had been advancing across an open field when a Panther, positioned on a distant ridge nearly 1,500 meters away, fired. The shell missed by mere meters. Miraculously, as his driver had continued evasive maneuvers, the Panther fired 3 more shots in rapid succession, each missing their mark, despite the German tank's renowned accuracy. Kursk, July 1943. The summer heat was oppressive, amplified inside the steel confines of Kropotkin's T-34 tank. Sweat stung his eyes as he peered through the commander's vision port, scanning the undulating terrain ahead. The massive Soviet counterattack had begun, pushing back against Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great offensive on the Eastern Front. The air reeked of cordite, diesel exhaust, and the metallic tang of fear that no veteran would openly acknowledge. "Driver, maintain course 30 kilometers per hour, Kropotkin ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. At 33, He was ancient by the standards of Soviet tank commanders, most of whom were lucky to survive their first month of combat. 3 years of constant warfare had stripped away any romantic notions about glorious combat, leaving only a grim determination to survive and prevail. His crew, driver Ivan Petrov, gunner Mikhail Baranov and loader Dmitry Sokolov, were similarly seasoned, their movements inside the cramped fighting compartment exhibiting the fluid coordination that came only with experience. The T-34 crested a small rise, its diesel engine roaring as it pushed the 26-ton vehicle forward. Through his vision blocks, Kropotkin caught a fleeting glimpse of something on a distant ridgeline, the unmistakable silhouette of a tank, its long-barreled gun swinging toward them. "Enemy tank, 2 o'clock, he shouted, his body tensing instinctively. "Driver, evasive maneuvers!" Petrov responded instantly, throwing the T-34 into a series of unpredictable turns, the tank lurching violently as it changed direction. Kropotkin was nearly thrown from his position as the tank swerved, his head smacking against the turret ring. A split second later, a flash illuminated the ridge, followed by the signature crack of a high-velocity round. The shell passed just meters from their turret, close enough that Kropotkin could hear its distinctive shriek over the roar of their own engine. "Panther!" Baranov shouted from the gunner's position. New German tank. The Soviet crews had been briefed on this new threat, but few had actually encountered one yet. The Panther was rumored to be Germany's answer to the T-34, combining sloped armor with a devastating long-range gun. "Load armor-piercing!" Kropotkin ordered, even as he calculated their chances. The T-34's 76mm gun was outclassed by the Panther's 75mm KWK-42, which could penetrate their armor at much greater ranges than they could effectively return fire. Their best hope was to close the distance rapidly or find cover. "Driver, zigzag pattern, maximum speed." As the T-34 lurched forward in an erratic pattern, the Panther fired again. Kropotkin watched in amazement as the shell impacted the ground 10 meters to their left, sending up a geyser of dirt and rocks. A third shot followed, then a fourth, both missing as the T-34 continued its unpredictable movement pattern. It seemed impossible that such a reportedly accurate weapon could miss 4 consecutive shots. "They cannot hit a moving target," Kropotkin realized with sudden clarity. "Driver, maintain erratic movement. Gunner, prepare to fire when we reach 800 meters. Now, as part of a technical exchange program between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, Kropotkin found himself in that same workshop outside Frankfurt, examining captured Panthers alongside his American counterparts. At 35, Kropotkin was older than most Soviet tank officers. His survival through 4 years of the most brutal combat on the Eastern Front testament to both his skill and fortune. He ran his hand along the gun mantlet of the Panther, his fingers touching the precision machine steel with the reverence of one warrior for another. "We always wondered," he said in heavily accented English, "why such excellent gun would miss moving targets. Our T-34 has no stabilizer, yet sometimes we hit better when moving than Panthers." Captain Miller nodded thoughtfully. "That's precisely what we're trying to figure out, Lieutenant. The German engineering is impeccable in so many ways. The gun, the optical sights, the armor design, yet there's this glaring deficiency that seems to contradict everything else about the tank's design philosophy." He pointed to the components they had extracted from the turret mechanism. "And I think we've just found our answer." Kropotkin moved closer to examine the disassembled elevation mechanism, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing what was missing. In his previous life before the war, he had been a mechanical engineer at the Kirov factory in Leningrad, working on the development of the KV series of heavy tanks. Although the Soviet tanks never incorporated stabilization systems during the war, he was familiar with the concept from theoretical studies. "No gyroscope," he stated simply. "No hydraulic compensation system. German gun moves exactly as tank moves." Thompson nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. The Panther's gun elevation is entirely mechanical. When the tank pitches up or down while moving over terrain, there's nothing to counteract that movement. The gunner has to constantly readjust his aim manually." He gestured toward a partially disassembled Sherman turret in another part of the workshop. "Our tanks have had gyroscopic stabilizers since 1941. They're not perfect. They only work in the vertical plane and are most effective at lower speeds. But they give our gunners a fighting chance at hitting targets while on the move or immediately after stopping." Miller rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The real question is why. The Germans certainly had the technical capability to develop stabilization systems. They used gyroscopic technology in their aircraft and naval gunnery. Why leave it out of their tanks? especially when they put so much emphasis on gun accuracy. The morning light streamed through the windows of the workshop as Major William Jennings entered, his uniform immaculate despite the grimy surroundings. At 45, Jennings represented the old guard of the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department, a career officer with little practical engineering experience but considerable political acumen. He had been sent to oversee the technical intelligence operation and ensure any valuable findings were properly documented for Washington. "Gentlemen, I understand you've made a discovery," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of Boston's upper class. "Please enlighten me." Lieutenant Thompson straightened and gestured toward the disassembled components laid out on a workbench. "Sir, we've been examining the turret traversing and gun elevation systems of the Panther. As you know, our Sherman tanks are equipped with a gyroscopic stabilizer that keeps the gun relatively steady in the vertical plane while the tank is moving. This allows our gunners to maintain their aim point even over rough terrain, significantly increasing first hit probability when stopping briefly to fire, what we call shoot and scoot tactics." Thompson picked up a cylindrical component from the Panther. "This is the equivalent motor from the Panther's gun elevation mechanism. Notice anything unusual about it?" He handed the heavy metal cylinder to the Major, who turned it over in his hands with a puzzled expression. "It seems unremarkable," Jennings replied, clearly not seeing whatever Thompson was driving at. Miller stepped in. "That's exactly the point, sir. It's just a motor. A well-built one, certainly, but there's no gyroscopic stabilizer connected to it. The Germans designed a tank with superior firepower and excellent optical sights, but they completely neglected to include any form of stabilization system. It's as if they built a precision rifle, but forgot to include a way to steady the shooter's arm." Jennings frowned, his military mind immediately grasping the tactical implications. "Are you certain? This seems like a fundamental oversight for a nation renowned for its engineering prowess." "Completely certain, sir," Thompson confirmed. "We've examined 3 different Panthers now, all late-model OSFG variants. None of them have any form of gun stabilization. We've consulted the captured technical manuals as well. There's no mention of a stabilization system because none exists." Kropotkin, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up. "In Soviet Union, we tested captured Panther in 1944. Our engineers noted same thing, but we thought perhaps Germans had removed system before tank was captured. Now we see it was never there to begin with." Major Jennings paced slowly around the Panther's hull, his mind working through the combat implications. "This could explain a great deal about our battlefield experiences. Our tankers have consistently reported that Panthers were deadly accurate at long range from stationary positions, but much less effective in fluid engagement scenarios or when forced to fire on the move." He turned back to the engineers. "I want a comprehensive report on this finding. Compare the Panther's fire control system with our Sherman stabilizer technology. Document everything." As Jennings departed to make a telephone call to headquarters, Miller, Thompson, and Kropotkin continued their examination of the Panther's gun control mechanisms. Thompson picked up a technical diagram of the Sherman's Westinghouse stabilizer system, spreading it on the workbench beside the disassembled Panther components for comparison. "The principle is really quite simple," Thompson explained. "The Sherman system uses a gyroscope to establish a vertical reference. When the tank pitches up or down while moving, oil-operated hydraulic motors automatically adjust the gun's elevation to maintain the same relationship to the horizontal plane." He traced a finger along the diagram. "It's not perfect. The gun still moves somewhat and there's no stabilization in the horizontal plane, but it gives our gunners a significant advantage, especially when employing shoot and scoot tactics." Miller nodded. "The real genius is in the integration with the gunner's controls. The stabilizer doesn't prevent the gunner from making manual adjustments. It works with him, countering the gross movements of the tank while allowing fine aiming adjustments." Kropotkin examined the diagram with professional interest. Soviet designers considered similar system early in war, but production realities made it impossible. Too complex for our factories, too difficult to maintain in field conditions. He gestured toward the Panther. "But Germans had technical capability. Why not implement?" "I think it was doctrinal," Miller replied. "From what we've gathered from prisoner interrogations and captured documents, German tank doctrine emphasized firing from stationary positions, using their superior optics and gun performance to engage at ranges where enemy return fire would be ineffective. Their entire tactical approach presumed they would always have time to stop, aim carefully, and fire." Thompson snorted. "The battlefield rarely accommodates textbook tactics." I spoke with crews from the 2nd Armored who encountered Panthers in the Ardennes. They said the Germans were often forced to fire while moving or immediately after stopping because our tactics specifically sought to deny them the luxury of setting up ideal firing positions. Same on Eastern Front, Kropotkin added. After Kursk, Soviet tactics evolved. We learned to close distance quickly, use terrain to approach from multiple directions. Force German tanks to react, to move, to fire without perfect preparation. He smiled grimly. When Panther must shoot quickly, or while moving, advantage of superior gun is much reduced. On the Eastern Front, 1944, the wheat fields outside Kovel, Ukraine, stretched toward the horizon like a golden sea, punctuated by the occasional island of burnt-out vehicles and crater-pocked earth. Obersturmführer Klaus Werner of the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking stood in the commander's cupola of his Panther AOSF-G, scanning the terrain ahead through his binoculars. At 27, Werner was a veteran of 3 years of Eastern Front combat, having fought from the gates of Moscow to the steppes of Ukraine. His face, once youthful and idealistic, had hardened into a mask of permanent vigilance. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, turning the interior of the Panther into a steel oven. Despite the discomfort, Werner remained focused on the tactical situation. His company had been tasked with holding a critical road junction against an expected Soviet probe. Intelligence suggested elements of a Soviet tank brigade were moving in their direction, likely T-34-85s with supporting infantry. The Panther's crew exemplified the changing nature of the German military as the war progressed. Werner himself was a veteran, as was his driver, Unterscharführer Heinrich Müller, 30-year-old former truck driver from Hamburg. The gunner, Unterscharführer Franz Becker, was newer, a 19-year-old recruit who had joined the unit 6 months earlier after abbreviated training. The loader, Rottenführer Josef Schmidt, was a 20-year-old who had been transferred from the Luftwaffe ground personnel after the devastating Allied bombing campaigns had reduced Germany's air capabilities. The radio operator hull machine gunner, Sturmann Wilhelm Krause, was the youngest at 18, a Hitler Youth graduate who still retained traces of fanatical enthusiasm despite the increasingly desperate strategic situation. Maintain position here. Hull down behind this rise, Werner ordered. Müller shut down the engine but remain ready to start immediately on my command. We need to conserve fuel. Fuel shortages had become a critical issue for German armored units, with allocations constantly reduced as Allied bombing disrupted the Reich's petroleum infrastructure. The Panther was positioned with only its turret visible from the front, its hull protected by the natural contour of the terrain. This was optimal German tank tactics, using terrain to maximize the effectiveness of their superior long-range gunnery while minimizing exposure of vulnerable areas. Werner had carefully selected firing positions for all 5 tanks in his platoon, creating interlocking fields of fire that would force any advancing Soviet armor to face multiple threats simultaneously. Through his binoculars, Werner surveyed the rolling terrain to their front. The wheat fields provided excellent visibility in most directions, though several small copses of trees and a shallow ravine offered potential concealment for advancing forces. His position provided a commanding view of the main approach routes, with clear fields of fire extending to nearly 2,000 meters, well within the effective range of the Panther's KWK-42L70 gun. Gunner, reference point 1, anti-tank gun emplacement, Werner directed, guiding Becker through a methodical registration of potential target areas. Range, 1,200 meters. Target identified, 1,200 meters, Becker confirmed. His eye pressed to the Turmziel Fernrohr 12A, DZF 12A gun sight, one of the finest optical sights in any tank of the war. The magnified view allowed precise targeting at extreme ranges, another advantage the Panther held over its Soviet counterparts. Reference point 2, Crossroads, range 1,600 meters. Crossroads identified, 1,600 meters. This process continued for several minutes, as Werner ensured his gunner was thoroughly familiarized with the terrain and had mentally registered key targeting points. It was standard German procedure, reflecting their emphasis on methodical preparation and precise gunnery. An hour passed with no enemy contact. The heat inside the tank became increasingly oppressive. Werner permitted his crew to open hatches for ventilation, but remained vigilant, rotating observation duties to maintain constant surveillance. Water was rationed carefully. Supply lines had become increasingly unreliable as the Soviet advance pushed German forces westward. Movement northeastern sector. Krause suddenly reported from his radio operator's position, where he had been monitoring the left flank through his vision port. Dust cloud, approximately 3 kilometers. Werner immediately raised his binoculars, focusing on the indicated area. A distinct column of dust was visible, moving steadily in their direction. "Good spotting, Kraus," he acknowledged. "All crew, close hatches, prepare for combat. Müller, start engine." The Maybach HL230P30 engine roared to life, its 700 horsepower ready to maneuver the 45-ton behemoth if necessary. "Radio all units," Werner instructed. "Possible enemy armor approaching from northeast. Maintain radio discipline. Report only confirmed contacts." German communication security was rigorous, with strict limitations on unnecessary radio traffic that might be intercepted or triangulated by Soviet signal intelligence. As the dust cloud grew closer, Werner began to distinguish individual vehicles, the unmistakable silhouettes of T-34-85 tanks, at least a company strength of 10 to 12 vehicles, accompanied by truck-borne infantry. They were advancing cautiously but directly toward the German positions. "Target T-34, 2 o'clock, range approximately 800 meters, he called down to his gunner, Unterscharführer Franz Müller. The 19-year-old gunner, a replacement who had joined the unit just 3 months earlier, pressed his eye against the Turmzilfernrohr 12A gun sight. The optics were among the finest in the world, giving the Panther a significant advantage in long-range engagements. "I see it, Herr Obersturmführer," Müller confirmed as he traversed the turret, the electric motor humming as it rotated the massive gun. Werner watched as the Soviet tank moved across their front, oblivious to their presence. "Load armor-piercing," he ordered. The loader slammed a 75mm Panzergranate 3942 shell into the breech with a metallic clang. "Ready," he reported. Werner calculated the intercept point for the moving target. "Fire when ready," he commanded. Müller squeezed the firing pedal, but at that exact moment their driver adjusted course slightly to improve their hull-down position. The subtle movement of their tank caused the gun to shift just enough that the round passed behind the T-34, sending up a geyser of dirt in the field beyond. "Verdammt," Werner cursed. "Reload and hold position." He had experienced this frustration countless times before. The Panther's magnificent gun rendered less effective by its inability to maintain a steady aim point while the tank was in motion, even slight motion. German doctrine emphasized firing from a complete stop, but battlefield realities often demanded firing on the move or with minimal halt time. The absence of a stabilization system meant that every minor movement of the tank's hull translated directly to the gun's position, requiring constant readjustment by the gunner. "Driver, full stop, maintain position," Werner ordered sharply. "Gunner, re-aim, same target." The Panther shuddered to a complete halt, its suspension settling. Becker quickly readjusted his aim, compensating for the T-34's continued movement. "On target," he reported. "Fire." The Panther's gun roared, the 75mm armor-piercing round streaking toward the Soviet tank. This time the shot found its mark, striking the T-34's turret at an oblique angle. Sparks flew as the round penetrated, followed by a small secondary explosion as ammunition inside the tank detonated. The T-34 shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its open hatches as the crew attempted to escape. "Target destroyed," Becker called out, a note of excitement in his young voice. "Good shot," Werner acknowledged coolly, "but we've revealed our position. Driver, prepare to change position after next shot." He swiveled his cupola, locating a new target. Second T-34, moving left to right behind the burning tank, range 900 meters. "Target acquired," Becker confirmed, traversing the turret to track the new threat. "Fire when ready." The gun thundered again, but this time the round fell short, kicking up dirt in front of the moving Soviet tank. The T-34 immediately changed direction, its commander now alert to the threat. "They've spotted us," Werner observed grimly. "All tanks, engage targets of opportunity." Over the radio, he could hear the other Panther commanders acknowledging as his platoon opened fire, the coordinated volley striking the Soviet formation like a hammer blow. 3 more T-34s were hit in rapid succession, 2 catastrophically. The remaining Soviet tanks began evasive maneuvers, moving rapidly in unpredictable patterns while returning fire. Their 85mm guns were fully capable of penetrating the Panther's armor, particularly on the flanks or rear. Several rounds impacted near Werner's position, showering the tank with dirt and rock fragments. "Driver, move to alternate position Alpha," Werner ordered, designating a prepared position 100 meters to their right. As Müller engaged the transmission, the Panther lurched forward, emerging from its hull-down position to traverse the open ground between positions. T-34, direct front, closing rapidly, Kraus shouted from his position. Werner spotted the threat immediately, a T-34-85 charging directly toward them at full speed, already within 400 meters and closing. "Gunner, frontal target, emergency," he called. Becker swung the gun toward the oncoming threat, but as the Panther moved across the uneven ground, the gun bounced wildly, making precise aim impossible. "Cannot stabilize aim," the gunner reported frantically. "Driver, short halt," Werner commanded. Müller immediately stopped the tank, allowing Becker a moment of stability to aim. The pause was dangerously long, nearly 4 seconds as the gunner struggled to acquire the rapidly approaching target. "Fire," Werner ordered, his voice tense. The gun roared, but the round passed over the T-34's turret as the Soviet tank crested a small rise at the exact moment of firing. Before Becker could re-aim, the T-34 fired its own 85mm gun. The Soviet shell struck the Panther's upper glacis at an angle, failing to penetrate the thick frontal armor, but causing spalling inside the fighting compartment. Fragments of metal ricocheted around the interior, striking Kraus in the arm and shoulder. "Kraus is hit," Schmidt reported, reaching toward the wounded radio operator. "Maintain position, load next round," Werner ordered sharply. "Driver, reverse, return to defilade position." The Panther began backing toward the protective rise, its engines straining. "Enemy infantry, right flank!" came a call over the radio from another Panther commander. Werner swiveled his cupola to see Soviet infantry emerging from the small copse of trees, carrying anti-tank rifles and satchel charges. They had used the distraction of the tank engagement to infiltrate dangerously close to the German position. "Kraus, man the hull machine gun if you can," Werner ordered. The wounded radio operator grimly pulled himself back to his position, operating the MG-34 with his uninjured arm. The 7.92mm machine gun chattered, cutting down several advancing Soviet infantrymen. The battle devolved into a chaotic close-quarters engagement, the precise long-range combat preferred by German armor doctrine, replaced by a desperate struggle at point-blank ranges. The Panthers maintained a disciplined fire, destroying 7 Soviet tanks, but lost 2 of their own to flanking T-34s and infantry attacks. As the Soviet force finally withdrew, leaving the field littered with burning vehicles, Werner slumped in his commander's seat, exhaustion temporarily overcoming discipline. The engagement had demonstrated both the Panther's strengths and its critical weaknesses. Its gun and frontal armor were superb. Its mechanical reliability had improved significantly from the early models, but its inability to fire accurately while moving had nearly proven fatal when forced into mobile combat at close range. Back in the Frankfurt workshop, Lieutenant Thompson was demonstrating the Sherman stabilizer system to his Soviet counterpart. He had partially disassembled a Sherman turret mechanism to expose the Westinghouse gyroscopic stabilizer unit. "The principle is actually quite simple," he explained. "The gyroscope establishes a vertical reference point. When the tank pitches up or down while moving, the system detects the deviation from vertical and activates hydraulic motors to keep the gun at the same elevation relative to the horizon." Kropotkin studied the mechanism with interest. "Our design bureaus experimented with similar systems before war, but never implemented in production. Time was too short." He paused, thinking. "So German engineers never developed such system at all?" Miller shook his head. "That's what's so surprising. The Germans were at the forefront of gyroscopic technology before the war. They used advanced gyrostabilizers in their aircraft and naval gunnery systems, yet somehow they never applied this technology to their tanks." He pointed to the Panther's elevation mechanism. "Look here, they even had a pneumatic balance system to help the gunner handle the weight of the gun, but no actual stabilization. It's a fundamental design oversight that affected their combat effectiveness throughout the war." Thompson pointed to another component. "The Sherman stabilizer isn't perfect, but it provides a critical edge in certain combat scenarios. Our tests show that a Sherman moving at 15 miles per hour over moderate terrain maintains approximately 70% of its stationary accuracy for the first shot. Without the stabilizer, that figure drops to below 30%. But more importantly," Miller added, "it drastically reduces the time between stopping and firing accurately. A Sherman with a properly functioning stabilizer can fire an accurately aimed shot within 1 second of stopping. Panther requires the gun to settle after movement, which can take 3 to 4 seconds, an eternity in tank combat." Major Jennings, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up. "So what you're telling me is that our Sherman tanks, which the Germans routinely mocked as being inferior, actually possessed a significant technological advantage over the vaunted Panther." "Exactly, sir," Thompson replied. "The Sherman's stabilizer wasn't perfect. It only worked in the vertical plane, not horizontally, and it was most effective at speeds under 15 miles per hour. But even that limited stabilization gave our tanks a crucial edge in certain combat scenarios, particularly in the fluid, fast-moving engagements that characterized much of the campaign across France and the Low Countries. Kropotkin added his perspective. In Eastern Front, terrain is often more open. German tanks could engage at longer ranges, where their superior optics and gunpowder gave advantage. But in close combat, especially in forests or villages, ability to fire accurately while moving, even a little bit, is very valuable. He gestured toward the Panther. This machine was designed for ideal conditions, not real battlefield. Captain Miller wiped his hands on a rag as he considered the implications. I think it reflects a fundamental difference in design philosophy. The Germans built tanks that excelled in very specific conditions, long-range engagements from stationary positions. They emphasized theoretical perfection over practical combat utility. Meanwhile, we Americans designed the Sherman to be adaptable, reliable, and effective across a wide range of combat scenarios. Jennings nodded slowly. Interesting theory, Captain. But I wonder, could it also have been a production consideration? The Sherman stabilizer is a complex piece of equipment requiring precision manufacturing. Perhaps the Germans simply couldn't spare the industrial capacity. That's certainly possible, sir, Miller acknowledged. By 1943, German industry was under tremendous strain from Allied bombing and resource shortages. Adding another complex subsystem to the Panther would have further complicated production and maintenance. However, Thompson interjected, the stabilizer wasn't added to the Sherman as an afterthought. It was integrated from the beginning, before America even entered the war. It represents a fundamental design philosophy that values practical combat effectiveness over theoretical performance metrics. Kropotkin had been examining the Panther's turret ring and gun mounting with professional interest. There is space here, he noted, pointing to areas within the turret assembly. Germans could have added stabilizing system if they wanted to. Design would accommodate it. I agree, Miller said. This wasn't a physical limitation, it was a conceptual one. The Germans simply didn't prioritize the ability to fire accurately on the move because it didn't fit their tactical doctrine. Tankstadt Production Plant, Germany, August 1943. The cavernous factory floor buzzed with activity as workers assembled the latest generation of Panther tanks. Steel tracks clanked along the production line as partially completed hulls moved from station to station. The air was thick with the smell of metal, oil, and the sweat of laborers working under the constant pressure of wartime production quotas and increasingly frequent Allied bombing raids. The Tankstadt facility was a marvel of German industrial organization, having been rapidly expanded after the start of the war. Massive overhead cranes moved major components, hull sections, turrets, engines, between assembly stations. The workforce was a mix of German skilled laborers, conscripted workers from occupied territories, and a growing number of forced laborers whose hollow cheeks and sunken eyes spoke of the deteriorating conditions as Germany's wartime economy strained under increasing pressure. Production lines that had once been orderly and methodical now showed signs of the frantic pace demanded by the high command. Quality control checkpoints had been reduced, and materials shortages meant frequent substitutions and compromises. The elegant design principles that had once characterized German engineering were increasingly sacrificed to the desperate need for more tanks, quickly. Dr. Heinrich Keller, chief engineer for the Panther program, walked briskly alongside Oberst Wilhelm Voller, a Panzer officer sent from the Eastern Front to provide feedback on the tank's performance in combat. Keller was 48, thin and intense, with wire-rimmed glasses that he constantly adjusted, a civilian scientist thrust into the heart of Germany's war machine. As you can see, Herr Oberst, we've implemented several modifications based on field reports, Keller explained. Improved transmission components, better engine cooling, simplified road wheels for easier maintenance. Voller, a weathered combat veteran at 36, nodded as he examined a partially assembled turret. These are welcome improvements, Herr Doctor, but my gunners continue to report difficulties with accurate fire while on the move. The Soviet T-34s, despite their inferior optics, sometimes seem more capable of hitting targets during maneuver combat. Have you considered implementing a stabilization system similar to what we understand the Americans are using? Keller's expression tightened. We have studied the concept thoroughly, Herr Oberst. Our engineers even developed experimental gyroscopic systems. He lowered his voice. However, the Reich Ministry of Armaments has not prioritized such development. The additional production complexity, materials requirements, and training needs were deemed unnecessary complications. The truth was more complex than Keller admitted. German tank doctrine emphasized firing from stationary positions, using the superior range and penetration of their guns to destroy enemy tanks before they could close to effective combat range. Stabilization systems were viewed as a crutch that encouraged poor gunnery practices rather than an enhancement to combat effectiveness. Moreover, the intricate mechanics of effective stabilizers would have further strained Germany's already overtaxed precision manufacturing capacity. Voller's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information. He had seen too many Panthers miss crucial shots when forced to fire on the move during fluid battlefield conditions. Herr Doctor, with all due respect, the battlefield rarely conforms to theoretical doctrine. My men face situations where they must fire while moving or risk destruction. This is not a luxury but a necessity. Keller sighed, removing his glasses to clean them. I understand your frustration, Herr Oberst, but we must work within our constraints. The Führer has approved the current design, and our production priorities are fixed. We focus on producing more tanks with the existing design rather than fewer tanks with experimental features. Left unspoken was the reality that Germany was losing the war of industrial capacity, with Allied bombing increasingly disrupting production and critical materials growing scarcer by the month. They continued their tour, stopping at a station where workers were installing the Panther's sophisticated optical sighting system. Our TZF-12A gun sight remains the finest in the world, Keller noted with professional pride. It allows accurate targeting at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters under optimal conditions. Voller acknowledged this with a nod. The optical quality is indeed superior. My gunners can identify and range Soviet tanks at distances their gunners cannot even see us clearly. But this advantage is negated when we are forced into close-range mobile engagements, which are becoming increasingly common as the Soviets adapt their tactics. Perhaps the solution lies in tactical adaptation rather than technical modification, suggested a new voice. Both men turned to see Oberst Hans Meyer, a staff officer from the Panzer Training Directorate who had joined their tour. Meyer was a theoretical purist, having spent most of his career developing doctrine rather than implementing it in combat. Our training emphasizes proper positioning and engagement at optimal ranges. If units are finding themselves in close-range mobile combat, perhaps they are not properly executing established doctrine. Voller's expression darkened. Herr Oberst, with respect, the enemy gets a vote in how battles unfold. The Soviets have learned to use terrain, smoke, and coordinated infantry attacks to force close engagements. They deliberately seek to negate our technological advantages. His voice carried the unmistakable weight of frontline experience. Doctrine must adapt to battlefield realities, not the other way around. Meyer stiffened at the implicit criticism. Our doctrine is sound, developed from years of combat experience. The issue is likely one of proper implementation and crew training. Before the disagreement could escalate, Keller intervened diplomatically. Gentlemen, perhaps there is merit in both perspectives. We continue to refine the Panther's design within our constraints, while also evolving tactical doctrine. He gestured toward another part of the factory floor. Let me show you the improvements we've made to the transmission system, which should increase reliability significantly. As they moved on, a worker on the assembly line caught Voller's eye briefly. The man, clearly not a voluntary German laborer, looked away quickly, but not before Voller noticed something in his gaze, a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Was it satisfaction? The Oberst found himself wondering if the strategic bombing campaign was affecting morale among the forced laborers, perhaps even leading to subtle forms of sabotage. It was yet another variable in the increasingly complex equation of Germany's war production, one that no amount of technical refinement could fully address. Later that evening, Keller sat alone in his office, reviewing the day's production reports. The numbers were troubling. Part shortages, increasing quality control issues, labor problems. The Panther was a brilliant design in many ways, but its complexity made it vulnerable to the cascading problems of Germany's wartime economy. On his desk sat a folder containing preliminary designs for a gyroscopic gun stabilization system adapted from German naval technology. The engineering was sound, potential benefits clear. Yet he knew it would never be implemented, not because it wasn't valuable, but because the brutal arithmetic of production quantities versus production time made it impractical at this stage of the war. Keller closed the folder with a sense of professional regret. The Panther would go into combat without stabilization, its crews forced to adapt to this limitation through tactical workarounds. It was one of countless compromises being made as the Reich's industrial capacity strained to match the overwhelming production might of its enemies, a technical detail that reflected the larger strategic reality of a war that Germany was slowly, inexorably losing. As twilight settled over Frankfurt, Captain Miller and Lieutenant Kropotkin stood on the loading dock outside the technical intelligence workshop, sharing a moment of quiet reflection after the intense day of analysis. The spring evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming trees, a stark contrast to the mechanical environment they had been immersed in all day. Miller offered Kropotkin an American cigarette, which the Soviet officer accepted with a nod of thanks. As they smoked in companionable silence, Miller contemplated the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Two men from vastly different worlds, united temporarily by their shared technical interest in the machines of war. "You know," Miller said finally, "for all its flaws, the Panther was still a remarkable achievement. The Germans designed it from scratch in response to your T-34 and had it in production in less than a year." Kropotkin nodded, exhaling a stream of smoke. Impressive engineering. But tank is like soldier. Must adapt to reality of battle, not expect battle to adapt to tank." He gestured with his cigarette. "Your Sherman, it is not perfect tank, but it is good enough tank, in large numbers, with crews who survive to gain experience." "That's a good way to put it," Miller agreed. "The perfect is the enemy of the good enough. We built nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war. The Germans built maybe 6,000 Panthers, and most broke down before they could fight," Kropotkin added with a dry chuckle. "On Eastern Front, we captured many Panthers abandoned with mechanical problems. Perfect weapon useless if it cannot reach battlefield." Miller considered this. "It makes me think about the philosophy behind our respective approaches to the war. The Germans seemed obsessed with building the ideal tank, the perfect combination of firepower, protection, and mobility. We Americans focused on building a good enough tank in overwhelming numbers, with robust reliability and ease of maintenance. Soviet approach similar," Kropotkin observed. "T-34 not perfect, but simple, reliable, easy to produce in thousands. One T-34 might lose to one Panther, but 5 T-34s will always defeat one Panther." He tapped ash from his cigarette. "And 5 T-34s cost less to build than one Panther." Two men fell silent again, each contemplating the broader implications of their technical discoveries. Beyond the specific issue of tank stabilizers lay fundamental questions about industrial capacity, design philosophy, and the nature of modern warfare itself. "What will you do after war, Captain?" Kropotkin asked suddenly, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk. Miller looked surprised at the personal question. "Go back to Detroit, I suppose. Resume my engineering career, maybe apply what I've learned about armored vehicle design to civilian automobiles." He glanced at his Soviet counterpart. "And you?" Kropotkin's expression grew distant. "If still alive, rebuild. My home in Leningrad was destroyed in siege. Wife and daughter evacuated to Ural Mountains." A flicker of emotion crossed his weathered face. "Perhaps teach engineering if permitted. Much rebuilding needed in Soviet Union." The human dimension of the conflict, momentarily obscured by their technical focus, suddenly reasserted itself. These were not merely abstract questions of engineering design, but matters that had determined the survival of nations and the lives of millions. The tanks they had been analyzing were not merely technical artifacts, but weapons that had killed and maimed countless young men on both sides of the conflict. "Strange, is it not?" Kropotkin mused. "We spend years trying to destroy each other's tanks, and now we study them together." Miller nodded slowly. "War makes for strange situations, but I suppose understanding these machines might help prevent future conflicts, or at least make them less destructive." Kropotkin's expression suggested skepticism at this optimistic assessment, but he didn't contradict his American colleague. Instead, he extended his hand. "To better understanding between engineers, if not between nations." Miller shook the offered hand firmly. "I'll drink to that." He produced a small flask from his pocket. "Kentucky bourbon. Care for a taste?" Kropotkin smiled for the first time. "Only if you try Soviet vodka in return." He reached into his own jacket and withdrew a small metal flask embossed with Cyrillic lettering. As the two engineers shared their national spirits under the darkening German sky, the Panther tanks in the workshop behind them stood silent, their mechanical secrets gradually yielding to human analysis and understanding. April 1945, Allied Technical Intelligence Center, Eisenach, Germany. The conference room fell silent as Captain Miller concluded his presentation. Around the table sat senior officers from American, British, and Soviet technical intelligence units, all tasked with analyzing captured German equipment. Charts, technical diagrams, and photographs covered the walls, documenting the comprehensive analysis of the Panther tank systems. "In conclusion, gentlemen," Miller said, pointing to a comparative diagram of the Sherman and Panther elevation mechanisms. What we've discovered represents a significant blind spot in German tank design philosophy. Despite their renowned engineering prowess, they failed to implement even basic gun stabilization systems. Our tests confirm that this oversight reduced their first-round hit probability by approximately 38% when firing after movement or during short halts, and made accurate fire while moving virtually impossible. Colonel James Harrington, the senior American officer present, leaned forward. "Captain, your findings help explain several battlefield reports that previously seemed anomalous. Multiple unit commanders noted that Panthers often missed their first shot, particularly in meeting engagements where both forces were in motion." He turned to the Soviet contingent. "Does this align with your experiences on the Eastern Front?" Major Sergei Antonov, a veteran of the tank battles at Kursk and a technical liaison officer, nodded emphatically. "Da, Colonel. Our crews reported many times that German Panthers and Tigers had difficulty hitting moving T-34s, especially at closer ranges and on broken terrain. We attributed this to crew training, but systemic design limitation makes more sense." The irony wasn't lost on him. Soviet tanks, often criticized for their crude finishing and basic optics, had proven more practical in certain combat scenarios than their technically superior German counterparts. Lieutenant Thompson added a critical point. "What's particularly interesting is that this wasn't a limitation of German technology as a whole. Their aircraft and naval systems utilized advanced gyroscopic stabilizers throughout the war. This appears to have been a doctrinal blind spot specific to their tank design philosophy." The British representative, Wing Commander Charles Winthrop, who specialized in analyzing German technical intelligence, offered his perspective. "I believe this reflects a broader pattern we've observed across German weapons development, an emphasis on theoretical perfection over practical combat utility. They designed tanks for idealized combat conditions rather than the chaotic reality of the battlefield." "There's another factor worth considering," added Major William Peterson from American Army Ordnance. "Implementation of stabilization systems requires significant crew training to be effective. Our own experience with the Sherman showed that without proper training, crews often disabled the stabilizer rather than learning to work with it. Given the deteriorating training situation in the German army as the war progressed, even if they had installed such systems, they might have struggled to use them effectively." Colonel Harrington tapped his pencil thoughtfully on the table. "I'm curious about the psychological impact of this limitation. Captain Miller, did your interviews with captured Panther crews yield any insights about their awareness of this deficiency?" Miller nodded. "Yes, sir. Most were acutely aware of it, particularly veterans who had experienced combat against Shermans in fluid engagement scenarios. Several mentioned developing workarounds such as having the driver coordinate closely with the gunner to create brief stability windows for firing. However, these techniques required extensive crew experience and were difficult to implement under combat stress." The Soviet representative, Major Antonov, spoke up again. "In Soviet analysis, we noticed German preference for over-engineered solutions in many areas: complex interleaved wheel suspension, transmission systems too delicate for combat conditions, yet they neglect practical combat need for stabilized gun. This inconsistency is revealing." The British Wing Commander Winthrop stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "I suspect it relates to the fundamental German military philosophy of qualitative superiority. They believed superior firepower, armor, and optics would allow them to dictate the terms of engagement, forcing battles to occur under conditions that favored their technical advantages. When this assumption proved false, when the Allies refused to fight according to German preferences, their technical superiority was often negated." Lieutenant Thompson pulled out a set of photographs taken during their testing of captured Panthers. "Our comparative firing trials demonstrate this clearly. When firing from a stationary position at stationary targets, the Panther consistently outperformed the Sherman in accuracy and penetration. But the moment we introduced movement, either of the firing tank or the target, the Sherman's performance degraded much less dramatically than the Panthers." "Gentlemen," Colonel Harrington said, rising to his feet to signal the conclusion of the meeting, "I believe these findings have significant implications for post-war tank development. Captain Miller, I want your team to prepare a comprehensive report for transmission to Aberdeen Proving Ground and the Armored Fighting Vehicle Branch. This needs to be incorporated into our design thinking moving forward." As the meeting dispersed, Miller gathered his notes and diagrams. Technical analysis of the Panther's stabilizer, or lack thereof, had revealed something more profound than a mere engineering detail. It had illuminated a fundamental difference in military-industrial philosophy between Germany and its adversaries, a difference that had helped shape the outcome of the largest conflict in human history. Major Jennings circulated a report with the detailed findings. This information has already been transmitted to the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. It will inform both our ongoing combat operations and post-war tank development. What he didn't explicitly state was that American engineers were already incorporating lessons from both German successes and failures into designs that would eventually lead to the post-war Patton series of tanks, which would combine the firepower and armor protection philosophy of German designs with the practical reliability and combat effectiveness emphasized in American equipment. As technical intelligence officers from 3 Allied nations discussed the findings, the human dimension of the war seemed momentarily distant, yet for the men who had fought in these steel beasts, the technical details translated directly to life and death. American Sherman crews had benefited from a technology that gave them a crucial edge in certain combat scenarios, while German Panther crews had been handicapped by their tanks' inability to maintain accurate fire when moving, a limitation imposed not by technical inability, but by doctrinal rigidity and production priorities. In the months and years following the war, the lessons learned from analyzing the Panther would inform tank development across the globe. The Soviet T-54-55 series, the British Centurion, and the American M46 and M47 Patton tanks would all incorporate gun stabilization systems as standard features, recognizing the critical importance of accuracy while moving in modern armored warfare. The technical blind spot that had hampered the Panther would not be repeated, as all major tank-producing nations embraced the principle that effective tanks needed to be able to shoot accurately while on the move. The story of the Panther's missing stabilizers reminds us that technology alone does not determine battlefield outcomes. Human decisions, from design philosophy to tactical doctrine to industrial priorities, shape how technology is implemented and employed in combat. As we study the machines of war, we must never forget the human elements that ultimately determine their effectiveness: the engineers who design them, the workers who build them, the soldiers who operate them, and the leaders who decide how they will be used. In this complex interplay of human and machine, we find the true lessons of military history, lessons that remain relevant in our own time as nations continue to develop ever more sophisticated weapons of war. As you reflect on these technological battles within the greater conflict, consider how often seemingly minor design decisions have altered the course of history. The absence of stabilizers in German tanks is just one example of how engineering choices, doctrinal assumptions, and industrial limitations shaped the outcome of World War II. In our modern age of increasingly automated and computerized weapon systems, the human element in design, operation, and doctrine remains as crucial as ever. The lessons of the past continue to inform the military technology of today and tomorrow, if only we have the wisdom to heed them. The Panther tank remained an impressive achievement of German engineering, but its missing stabilizer system stood as a reminder of how even the most technically advanced fighting machines could be undermined by doctrinal blind spots and practical limitations. In the final accounting of history, it was not always the most perfect weapons that prevailed, but rather those that best balanced technical capability with practical combat effectiveness and industrial sustainability, a lesson written in steel and blood across the battlefields of World War II.